So I feel like it's time to talk about agile software development. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I've read a lot about this, and I've seen it in literally every place that I've worked at. And I've also heard about it in virtually every company that I've ever applied to. They've all brought up the fact that they use agile. So, what is it? It's agile is one of these topics that you can sit down and read about for an hour and then come away with it and not know how to explain it. It's such a nebulous topic, and it's such a nebulous, honestly, form of software development that it seems like every company that does agile has their own different spin to it. Now, I know there's a number of certifications in different frameworks of agile, like I think SAFe is one of them, and then there's the whole Agile manifesto. There's so many different versions of it and like updates to it that it gets really confusing, and it seems like companies have their own version that they use, whether or not it's actually agile. And then there's debates as to whether certain frameworks of agile are actually true agile as defined in the Agile manifesto. Like, I literally worked at one place that had that Agile manifesto printed out and put on the wall of all these things that Agile is. Like, Agile is, small incremental changes, and it's not waterfall. And literally, all waterfall is literally just doing work over a series of time. It's such an obscure thing, and it makes me crazy, to be honest with you. When companies talk about Agile, all they're saying is essentially that they work in sprints. And all sprints are is a fancy way to say that they work in predefined weeks, meaning they plan their work in increments of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. But that's all it is. And whenever a company says agile, I would really press on them as far in terms of what do they actually mean? Because at the root of agile, if you're doing it correctly, you should be employing test-driven development to guide how you're creating the stories, keep the stories really small, and make the sprints allow for moving things into the next sprint, and then estimating and then base your sprint velocity on last sprint, how many points you completed. And you can do that and it'll work. But honestly, what tends to happen is it just turns into waterfall. And because you're just taking a story from one sprint and applying it to the next sprint. And how is that any different from waterfall? And you can read lengthy articles about this describing how agile is different than waterfall. But when you actually put it into practice, try to figure out how it is. Honestly, try to see and write down all the differences between waterfall and agile when you're like 3 to 4 to 5 months into your project. I doubt that there's going to be a lot of differences, because agile promises to keep your workload flexible, hence the name agile. Agile promises to force you to write user stories that are small, but my problem with that is, what if the amount of work is big? Do you have to just write stories intentionally small to satisfy this condition and keep your sprint metrics correct? That's what happens, honestly. And a lot of companies that use Agile have their own different versions. Some companies do the whole post-it notes thing and put it on the wall and then they move it to in progress. Some companies use Jira. Some companies, it's kind of a free-for-all. They just use some messaging platform. Hopefully you're not doing that, but if you're using like Jira or some equivalent like Trello or whatever like that, you're probably just going to have a board, and you're probably going to have tasks on the board that are going to tell you what to do. You're going to pick it up, at the beginning of the sprint. You're going to work on it. You're going to give an update on it. And if it's 1, 3, 5 point, whatever it is, you're going to say I need more time, or this, might carry over to the next sprint. And that works in terms of, whoever is reporting data on that sprint, but it really doesn't work for developers, in my opinion, because it makes you have to work around the system. And honestly, there's way too much incentive just to game the system, meaning just to estimate your tickets way higher than what they should be, because it'll look like you're doing more, or it'll help the sprint metrics in terms of making it look like you did more total points, which increases the total sprint velocity for that sprint. And it's way too easy to game the system, but it's even harder. It's easy to game the system, but it's hard to accurately track it, because how do you track the quality of those points? And that's the hard part. How do you track the quality of estimates? What if a story was estimated at a 1, but it really took 5 points worth of work, but it was only bumped up to a 3 just to allow the discrepancy of time? That's not really a good estimate, because that 3 isn't reflective of what was actually done. What was actually done is 5 points worth of work, with maybe 4 points in there because of technical debt that was unforeseen. And if something was estimated at 5 points, but it only took a person a day, well, are you going to kick it down from a 5 to a 1? Maybe not, because it might mess up the whole sprint metrics. It might bring your whole sprint velocity down 4 points, and that's going to look bad on whoever has to report for the sprint. And this is where it's so difficult, because whose responsibility is it to handle and track all that? Is it the developer's responsibility? Is it the product managers? Is it the scrum masters? Or is it the engineering manager? Whose is it? Nobody really knows, and it varies by company to company. From the developer perspective, Agile is just a pain in the neck, because Agile makes you write stories really small, and it says that it's easier because, okay, if we write, Agile says that if you write smaller stories, you're going to write less code. It's going to be easier to test. You can make tests when you push that code out. It's easier to review, and it's easier to deploy. That's all. That's great and all. For some things that might work, but when you start getting into complex topics and complex things you're adding into the system, sometimes you just can't break that up into small chunks and make it work. Sometimes you can't deploy one piece without the other piece, without writing this like logic to accommodate the other part not being in there. So you end up writing it like these weird if statements to say, like, okay, if that part doesn't exist, then we don't execute this. It just gets really weird. And the next thing you know is you get something that's not accounted for, brought into the sprint. You work on that, and 2-3 weeks go by, and you come back and look at the code, and you're like, wait, what do I have to do here? Or worse, that person leaves the company. That might happen, and then you're left with this weird state in the system that nobody knows what to do with. And that might sound like a weird edge case, but honestly, it's not. Look how many layoffs there have been in the past, and look at the turnover rates for technology companies. It's very, very high. So the likelihood that person writing the code now, in 6 months, they might not be here. And that's just the reality of the job. So Agile is just so difficult to do in 2024 that, honestly, without extremely tight supervision over the process, it's just going to inevitably turn into waterfall. And what waterfall is basically is just load the sprint up at the beginning of the week and take stories off, and then push them to the next sprint. That's what it's going to reduce down to. And it's no fault of anybody. It's just what happens in the system because of things that aren't like directly connected to Agile. And technical debt, people leaving the company and new hires, and also just unplanned work for whatever reason just completely destroys the whole Agile process. Because unplanned work is all the work that's like, maybe another team brought up like, oh, we're going to be dropping support for this system, or you have to you ran into some like weird like server issue, or we all know what unplanned work is. So what happens if you bring that in and it accounts for like 10 points? Well, okay, do we bring that in, and then do we base the sprint velocity to include unplanned work? How do we divvy that up? What happens to our original commitments and stuff? And this is where it gets complicated, is because the developers have all the incentive to work on the unplanned work and all the technical debt and the system maintenance work. It's all the features and enhancements and all that stuff that other people want us to work on. That's where it gets complicated, because the incentive is different for them. The incentive is they want all the new stuff. They don't care about maintenance or upkeep or anything like that. Why do we need that? It's, nothing's broken, right? That's where the problem is. The developers, we don't have the incentive to work on that stuff. We have the incentive to make the system still functional. So you have these conflicting incentives, which completely throws off all the points. And obviously it might vary by company to company, but it just every place that I've seen Agile used in, it's just so different. Every place that I've talked to in interviews, they all say they do Agile, but when you ask them, it just means they're doing sprints. And I just think Agile has turned into this like it's just such a weird thing. It's like this talked about style of software development that's like grown into this like huge like, oh, we do agile software development, we're all fancy, we use all these corporate buzzwords. It's like, do you know what you're talking about? Like, it's turned into this super nebulous process that honestly is a bit weird. It really is. Like, people who are super into agile, like, why are we printing off like this like obscure document that was made in like early 2000s or whatever it was, like on our board, like describing these like abstract processes? Like, why don't I print out like documentation for our system and put it on the wall of like code? What are we doing here? And it's super weird. Honestly, I don't know why. Like, it's turned in, if you worked in a company with agile, you know that it's like a weird topic. Some people are super into it, and I'm not knocking, like, I don't care like if people like agile or like study or whatever like that. Do whatever you want, but understand that it just might not work in the way that you learned how it should in real functioning systems, and especially with developers who have varying skill sets, strengths and weaknesses, and just honestly the unexpected things that happen. That all throws wrenches in the agile process. Estimating is a whole other topic. Estimating is an educated guess, and estimating with points, I would say, is one of the most futile tasks and one of the biggest issues in software development is accurately estimating stories with points. And some people have different opinions about this, but estimating stories only works if everybody has equal knowledge of the system. Because let's face it, if somebody's never looked at something, they can't estimate it, right? If I've never looked at something, I'm going to give it a high point estimate. If somebody knows exactly what to do and they've been there 20 years, they're going to give it like a 1 point, like it's like a day's worth of effort. So do we just compromise and meet in the middle at a 3? That estimate doesn't make any sense, because it's too low for me and it's too high for the other person. So how does it work? That's why estimating is like, it almost would work better if whoever is planning on taking it then estimates it. Trying to have the whole team look at it and have like a complete understanding of the topic before estimating is just, that just doesn't make any sense, because it's asking something that can't be done. Not everybody can have a total and complete understanding of the part of the system as somebody else in a given instance of time before estimating. It's not going to happen. And in a perfect world, it's just not going to work. And I keep talking about this, but you're going to see it happen. The person who wrote that code is probably not going to be around in the future. And if they're the sole person that is providing these actual quality estimates and they leaves, let's face it, that new team is not going to be providing accurate estimates. And the accuracy is important because it's a difference of, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We don't know. And the other problem that I see happening is sometimes when you estimate stories very large, it's immediately met with skepticism, because it seems like the developer doesn't know what they're doing, and that, well, agile, we need to do smaller. Well, maybe not. It might actually take a month worth of effort, but that's not going to fly in an agile space. You're going to have to break that down and do everything. But it's like, yeah, but the work still has to be done. And that's my hang up with it, is like, I don't want to break this up just for the sake of breaking the story up for the sake of agile. Like, can we figure out a better way to go about that? Can we maybe just accept the fact that it really and truly does take 8 points worth of work or more than that, or we turn this thing into an epic, and then we add several 8 point stories into this because it needs to be reflected accurately the amount of work. And sometimes breaking it up, you lose sight of how much work actually goes into it, and that's the difficulty. And I worry that Agile only helps the people tracking the sprint metrics and not the developers who are actually doing the work. That's my fear with it. Now, other people might have had a different experience. Other people may actually like doing Agile. Maybe it works for you, but for me, I think it's just, honestly, I think it's gotten a little silly, in my opinion. And I think that we really need to scale back how much we're promoting Agile, how much we're talking about it, and honestly, how much it's marketed to people who are interviewing it at companies. Because if all we say is, yeah, we do Agile, it's like that can mean a million things now. I wish we talk about it in a little more. I wish we talked about software development processes in a little more plain English, and I wish that, uh, honestly, I wish we would just stop using these obscure terms to describe just starting a task and finishing a task, because all these obscure terms, acronyms, all this stuff just makes it unnecessarily complicated, and it just adds so much complexity. And when somebody starts on the team, it's like, what are we doing here? So, all that to say, I'm not the biggest fan of Agile. Maybe I have just missed the right book to read. Maybe I've just missed the wrong article or not taken the certification class or something. Maybe I've just missed it. Could be all wrong, but that's just been my experience at various places that I've seen it implemented. It always goes to waterfall. So I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts on Agile are, but I'd love to hear them. I'll see you in the next one.